Lead poisoning has been a public issue for decades in our neighborhood, our city, our region, and across the country. And it poses a threat to some of the most vulnerable in our society, our children. The consequences can be lifelong and, in some cases, life-threatening. The work of our coalition and the Community Foundation's committee to eliminate lead poisoning by the year 2030 just has begun. As a part of that work, we are fortunate to welcome the two foremost researchers and authors in the area, Gerald Markowitz and David Rosner. Welcome. Gerald Markowitz, let me just give you a little background of our authors who are here with us today. Gerald Markowitz is University Distinguished Professor of History at John Jay College and the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and Adjunct Professor of Social Medical Sciences at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. He earned a PhD and a Master's of Arts, both in history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a Bachelor of Arts from Earlham College. He is a recipient of a Robert Wood Johnson Investigator Award, National Endowment of the Humanities Research Award, and National Science Foundation grants, and numerous other grants. David Rosner is Ronald H. Luthenstein Professor of Social Medical Sciences and Professor of History at Columbia University, and co-director of the Center for the History of Public Health at Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health. He holds a PhD from Harvard University in the history of science, a Master's of Public Health from the University of Massachusetts, a Bachelor's of Arts from the City College of New York. He has been a Guggenheim Fellow, a recipient of a Robert Wood Johnson Investigator Award, a National Endowment of Humanities Fellow, a Josiah Macy Fellow, and a recipient of numerous other grants. Dr. Markowitz and Dr. Rosner are the co-authors of and co-editors of 7 books, including the subject of our program today, Lead Wars, the Politics of Science, and the Fate of America's Children. Reviewers from PBS to the New York Times have praised Lead Wars as fascinating, well-researched, and well-written. In summary, the definitive work on this history of this important subject. We are honored to have here today, please join me in welcoming the authors of Lead Wars, Gerald Markowitz and David Rosner.
Hi, I'm Jerry Markowitz. I'm going to start and then I'm going to hand it over to David. I would urge the people who are sitting in the back to move forward. We're going to be showing you some wonderful secret documents, and it's going to be hard for you to see them sitting way in the back. When I was in school, I always sat in the back, so I understand the impulse when you're in a school to do that. But I would urge you to come on up. I promise not to throw the microphone at you too often during the presentation. So first, I'd like to say what an honor it is for David and me to be here today. Um, we are historians, and we're proud to be historians. But many of you do the really crucial work in identifying lead poisoning in this community and helping people who have children who are lead poisoned to deal with this very serious public health problem. So we are very honored that you have invited us as historians to talk to you today. When David and I were on the plane coming up here, we realized that we have been working on lead poisoning for over 30 years now. And we've gone on to other areas, but we've always come back to lead. And I guess one of the reasons that we keep coming back to lead is that lead poisoning is one of the great public health success stories of the 20th century. It's a success story because we as a society got rid of lead in gasoline, we got rid of lead in paint, and we have reduced the average blood lead levels of children dramatically over the past 30 years. But the history of lead poisoning is also one of the great public health failures of the 20th century. And the reason I say that is lead poisoning is a totally preventable disease. And let me say that again. It is a totally preventable disease. And yes, and yet over 500,000 children have lead in their blood that is damaging their life chances. And so for us as historians trying to understand this, how can we as a society allow over 500,000 children to have their lives permanently damaged by not dealing with a totally preventable disease? And so the talk we're going to be giving today is a partial answer to that question. And the documents we're going to be showing you today came about as a result of a lawsuit that was filed in New York State, in New York City, and also in Buffalo. And through a process in the legal profession they call discovery, each side in a lawsuit gets to see what the other side has in their files. And as a result of that, we had access to hundreds of thousands of documents that the lead industry had in its files about what it knew about the dangers of lead, what it knew about the fact that children were dying of lead, what it knew about the fact that this was a public health tragedy, and what they did with that knowledge, and what they didn't do with that knowledge. So we're going to, I'm going to start off, and these are a whole series of articles that were in the Providence Journal. And they were in the Providence Journal because the state of Rhode Island sued 4 lead pigment manufacturers who put lead into the paint that was eventually put on walls that damaged children. And this was an unusual lawsuit because the lawsuit did not seek to recover past damages. It sought to have those lead pigment manufacturers pay to take the lead off of the walls of homes throughout Rhode Island. And frankly, I am a little disturbed at these articles because almost all of them are about David. The reason they're mostly about David is that there was a reporter when he was testifying. Each of us were on the stand for 5.5 days, and there wasn't a reporter when I was testifying, and I've never forgiven him for that, for the slight that the Providence Journal has given me. So these are these series of articles. And remarkably, at the end of this trial, a jury in Providence, Rhode Island, held 3 of the 4 lead pigment manufacturers responsible for taking the lead off of the walls of the homes of the state of Rhode Island. And that was an incredible victory. I cannot tell you how satisfying that was for us to know that we had played a small role in having a state be able to prevent future cases of lead poisoning. Unfortunately, that euphoria only lasted a couple of years because the Supreme Court of the state of Rhode Island overturned that jury decision and basically said that the case was filed under the wrong law, that it should have been filed under liability law rather than nuisance law, basically saying they should have sued for past damages, not for future protection. But of course, that's what the state wanted to do, was to prevent future damages. And you can see here, you probably can't see it very well, but this is Sherwin-Williams stock after the decision. And even if you can't see the numbers, you can see it went down dramatically. And so it really had an effect that, on that company. And we hoped it would have an effect on other companies from putting toxins in our children's environment. The New York Times business section had an article, "The Nuisance That May Cost Billions to Take the Lead Off of the Walls." Even though that case was overturned, there is a case that we also testified in California. 10 cities and counties sued 4 manufacturers of lead pigment, and there we testified for 3 days each. And that was before a judge, and a judge held these companies responsible for $1.1 billion to take the lead off of the walls of the homes of these 10 cities and counties in California. Again, a tremendous victory. That case is now on appeal. We are hopeful that that will stand. So that will be really quite extraordinary. So what we want to show you today is some of the material that we showed to the jury and we showed to the judge. And before we get to those documents, just to be clear, and I get upset whenever I see this picture, because I remember my own kids standing at a window when they were toddlers and chewing on the windowsill because they were teething. And this is the way that children get lead poisoning, doing something totally natural as part of their lives, or crawling on a rug that may have some lead dust on it, brought in from outside or from windows going up and down. It is such natural behavior by children, and yet they get poisoned by having that kind of activity. So when did we first know that lead dust from paint was causing damage to children? This is an article from Australia in 1904. 1904, over 110 years ago, we knew that lead in paint was causing damage to children. And this, in that article, they say, shortly I am able, I believe, and advance a very strong plea for painted walls and railings as the source of the lead, and for the biting of fingernails or sucking of fingers, as in a majority of cases, the means of conveyance of the lead to the patient. And that is the way children still get lead poison today, 110 years ago. Now, some people say, well, there are alternatives to lead. This is an ad from 1910, again, over 100 years ago. And zinc pigment was available in the 19th century. It was available throughout the 20th century. Titanium paints became available in the 20th century. Lithophone became available in the 20th century. And here you have, an ad from a zinc pigment manufacturer saying, you probably can't read that even in the front, lead poison and death, lead-free paint and life. And unfortunately, the lead pigment manufacturers and the zinc pigment manufacturers reached an agreement not to criticize each other's paints on the basis of health. And it's one of the reasons that this is one of the very few ads that talks about the dangers of lead in a commercial ad like this. So this is an article from 1917, almost exactly 100 years ago. This is the second article that is published in the United States about a child who dies as a result of exposure to lead. And they are talking about the Australians and their work, and talking about how the ingestion of lead causes the problem of lead poisoning because children are eating paint. This is a really interesting article, and it's a theme that is going to come up with David's talk as well. And that is that the lead pigment manufacturers and doctors who are associated with them would often blame the children rather than the paint itself. And this is an article about pica. And pica was blamed. Pica is the eating of non-food items by a child. And with some children, a very small minority of children, it is a compulsive behavior. They cannot help it. But for the vast majority of children, if they're teething or they're putting lead toys into their mouth or any toys in their mouth, then they get lead poison. So this is saying that the pica is a problem for some children. But what this doctor, John Ruddock, said, and he's saying that if pica involves chewing on non-lead products, it doesn't represent much of a problem. But here he's saying there is, however, one type of poisoning which the pica children acquire, and that is lead poisoning if they're chewing on lead. And the reason that he is so concerned about this is in the last line of this statement here. And this is from 1924. A child lives in a lead world. That if a child is surrounded by lead, inevitably, they are going to ingest some of it, they are going to be poisoned by it, and they, at this time, were in danger of going into convulsions and dying. So one of the responses of the lead industry to this was to start a campaign of appealing to children. And this is an ad from the National Lead Company, the largest producer of lead pigments, that is talking about paint companies and merchants catering to children, that this is the way they should behave. This one, I'm not going to be able to go into it, but you can see the racist Sambo image here in the 1920s from, that's very much playing on the hysteria in northern cities in the 1920s about blacks moving from the south to the north. But the ad here is, do not forget the children, someday they may be customers. And there were a variety of other ads. This is in National Geographic magazine, Lead Helps to Guard Your Health, at the time when children are dying from having lead as part of their experience from lead paint. This one, also in National Geographic, lead takes part in many games. This is one showing a toddler up against the wall. The ostensible purpose of this is to say lead paint is easily washable, but the implicit message, of course, is that it's perfectly safe for this toddler to be up against that lead-painted wall. And some ads in the National Lead Company's magazine, The Dutch Boy Painter. And these are a whole series of booklets that are about this big, and they are meant for children. And I'll show you that this is here. So you can see on one side, they're colored in. On the other side, the child is supposed to color them in with watercolors, not with lead-based paint. And unfortunately, I don't have time to read from these, but you can just see it's a whole plea for replacing wallpaper, which was perfectly safe, with lead-based paint, which was going to be literally killing children. And here you have the whole children's room painted with lead-based paint. And of course, at this time, you have a variety of articles talking about children being poisoned as a result of chewing on lead toys. The last slide I want to show you is an ad about putting lead in hospitals. Again, part of a larger effort to make lead seem like it is extremely safe. So I'm going to now turn it over to David, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Jerry. I'm going to go through these awfully quickly, but I just want to review. What Jerry showed you was a whole series of medical and public health articles that appeared in the first third of the 20th century. Starting in 1904 and going to 1930, we have literally scores of them about the dangers of lead paint and lead on the walls and the dangers to children that is appearing in the public health literature. He then showed you a public relations campaign to try to, in some sense, convince us that lead was not only not dangerous, but actually safe. Lead helps to guard your health, remember those. What I want to show you now are a series of slides that we found in the documents that we went through when we were writing that book and when we were writing our first book, Deceit and Denial, that talk to not only the medical articles, what was known in the medical press, and what the industry presented to the public, but what the industry knew internally in their own meetings about the dangers of lead. So you could explain, well, they're just doing a public relations campaign, but they don't really know. What I want to show you is that public relations campaign corresponded with the increase in knowledge and also corresponded to the actual knowledge within the industry itself. So I hope that these are clear. I don't know how to use this. Let me see. This is a handbook for painting that basically shows the formula for making lead paint. Because I think when we think of paint, I don't know how you think about it, but before I started doing this research, I thought of paint as a lot of liquid and a little color. I don't know how many of you thought of that. Some pigment that was put in to give some liquid some color. Here is the formulas for making lead paint that is going to tell you why we have such a giant public health problem today, okay? I just want to remind you also, it takes less than a thumbnail size slice of lead to send a kid into convulsions, okay? It takes much less than that to actually cause the kind of minimal brain damage, the perceptual problems, the hyperactivity, and all the other symptoms that we're now worrying about for children, learning disabilities that are affecting hundreds of thousands of children today. So when you look at these slides, remember how little lead is a serious neurological problem, okay? Here's the Dutch Boy. If you remember, Jerry talked about National Lead. They produced a product called Dutch Boy paint. So how many of you in the audience remember that? Okay, they're still around, I guess, but Dutch Boy, we all grew up with little Dutch Boy paint. I have little puppets of the Dutch Boy. We have little night lights with the Dutch Boy on it. All were advertising gimmicks that were used in the 50s when I was growing up, as late as the 1930s, 40s, and 50s when I was growing up. Well, I wasn't growing up then. But in any case, here's the formula. And the formula is Dutch Boy soft white lead paint, how to repaint your work, okay? And there are two slides I'm going to show you. One is the slide for primers, and the other one is the slide for the woodwork itself. For new work, you take 2 coats of a material made up like this. Interior plaster and wallboard, Dutch Boy wall primer, 3 parts white lead, 4 parts mixing oil. So almost for the primer, almost half a gallon of paint. And every gallon of paint you had would be made of white lead. And you put 2 coats of it on your walls. Then you would take interior plaster wall, board, and woodwork, and here you actually had half white lead, which is lead carbonate, that's the dangerous material, and half lead mixing oil. For those of you who have old garages that may have some old lead paint cans, and if you ever try to lift it, they're very heavy, okay? Very heavy because they were half lead, okay? So essentially what you did is you took 100 pounds of lead, mixed it 3 to 4 gallons of mixing oil, and you came out to 6 to 7 gallons of paint. In other words, if you divide 6 into 100, every can of paint had about 15 pounds of a serious neurotoxin in it, okay? Does that make some sense? So then when you're covering your house and you're doing 3 coats on your walls and you're using can after can every 5 years, in a few years, you literally on every room, you're going to have hundreds and hundreds of pounds of lead and neurotoxin on your walls. That's what the problem is for us, because it's still there. This is just what they were talking about in 1930. Of late, we have received, this is the Lead Industries Association, and they're saying, of late, we have received such undeserved publicity in newspapers damaging to lead products. The U.S. Daily gave prominence to a report of babies and children allegedly being lead poisoned by chewing paint on cribs. These are just some of the information. The general problem was how to establish a good name for lead and to counteract such unfair and unfavorable publicity. So they, from the very first, when they're discovering the dangers of lead and where they're thinking about what they're going to do about it, the way they perceive of the problem is essentially as a public relations problem, not a public health problem. That's really the important thing. They don't see it as a public health problem. They think it is a problem of unfair and unfavorable publicity. Hardly a day goes by, but this subject receives some attention in the headquarters. These are just the internal documents where they're talking about the problems that they're realizing are apparent in their product. This is 1930. They say, hardly a day goes by, the subject receives some attention in the headquarters of the association. We're constantly investigating alleged cases of lead poisoning and endeavoring to correct misstatements about the lead poisoning, to calm misapprehension about the toxic properties of the metal, and to accumulate all possible material of scientific value to help us in our efforts. I'm going to go through these quickly. If all other reasons for the establishment of our association vanished, the health problem, this is 1932, the health problem alone would justify its existence. I'm going to go through this. This is just a private meeting they had when they're talking about workers who are dying of lead poisoning, in which they talk about trying to pull all their teeth from their heads so that the lead line, which is the symptom for industrial lead poisoning, is gone when doctors from the Workers' Compensation Board looks at the children, if you're trying to get by it. I know I don't have much time. Jerry's going to kill me if I stay. So I think it is an important thing, at least taking care of the pyrrhea and yanking out a bunch of stumps, which most of them have, enabled us to cut down on the lead line, which the shyster lawyers will attack. So they're aware of the legal implications of their people dying, they're aware of the children dying, and this is their response, is to pull out their teeth so they don't have lead showing in their teeth, because the lead forms a blue line in their teeth. That's the kind of association we have. We have continued to meet attacks on lead due to its toxic qualities by correcting published erroneous statements. Year after year after year, these are the kinds of statements that appear in these records. We have procured a retraction of an inaccurate statement about lead poisoning in the magazine Safety Education. We have also tried to relieve apprehension about the use of lawns sprayed with lead arsenate for victory gardens. Anytime there was an attack on lead, any suspicion about the dangers of lead, they went out and counteracted. They introduced doubt about the studies. They threatened doctors. We have documents about their going to Harvard Medical School and telling a doctor who diagnosed lead poisoning that they were going to sue him for $1 million in 1942 for saying that he had found lead poisoning in children. He accepted a grant. He was never sued. He accepted a grant. He never again published an article about lead. And he died and wrote his autobiography, and he said this was one of the great embarrassments of his life, that he actually acceded to this fear from these lawyers. No problem facing the lead industry appears to be more important than the public and private attitude towards lead because of its toxic qualities. The very present anxiety, most of it needless, about old and new products of lead is of serious concern to the industry. We are giving much thought currently to setting up a program more comprehensive than any in which the association is already engaged to help bring about a better attitude on the part of the doctors and the public on lead in line with the facts. This is what they're talking about. I could go on with these things. I'll just go with a few things here. Attention to the serious problem. Did they know that there was a danger here while they're selling this material and having us all surrounded by this material? Attention to the serious problem faced by all of lead industries because of the toxic nature of our metal is occupying a growing rather than a diminishing amount of the association's time. This is largely owing to the attacks upon lead that cannot be ignored, for if unchallenged, they may very likely lead to the sponsoring of totally unwarranted state and federal legislation of a regulatory or prohibitive character. They want to make sure that government doesn't interfere, doesn't regulate it, doesn't ban it, doesn't say to get it out. This is what they're doing at this point. Suffice it to say here that this is an unending battle from which we can only withdraw at our peril. If we stop attacking those who are attacking lead, if we accede to the demands that we know are true, if we start addressing this problem seriously, we're going to be out of business. That's the battle they're in. We can't not pay attention to it. Some ads about painting at the same time, 1935, these notices are coming out. Dutch Boy Painter magazine, paint the interior of schools, use it on your bird feeder. Here's a whole house made of lead. This is what they're promoting. The roof is made out of lead, the walls are painted with lead, the fireplace has lead fixtures, the floor is made out of lead. This is market telling the white lead story to the nation. They're promoting lead at the very time they know kids are dying. This is an article about the chronic effects of lead, of low-level lead in 1945, of children who were dying from lead poisoning and actually developing long-term mental damage. This is a very important article. Randolph Byers was the doctor I was telling you about who was embarrassed at the end of his life because he exceeded their threats and did not publish again after this. An article about paint eaters, this is when it's becoming popular. Suddenly, at the same time that this information is going, they're still marketing this material as a benefit to children. They're bragging about it being a drop of solder that can go to close up some evaporated milk that children's going to drink. This is a series of images from documents about an attempt by the government to actually pass a very mild piece of regulation. And this is what they did. The state of Maryland, which was the center of lead epidemic, wanted to pass a bill, actually did pass a bill that essentially said you can't use lead in paint that's made to cover toys and cribs, right? Very simple. It didn't even say much about walls. It said you got to label it and you got to tell parents not to use it on toys and cribs. And that's I'm sorry. It made it unlawful to sell toys and playthings, including children's furniture, finished with any material containing lead or other substance of poisonous nature from contact with which children may be injuriously affected. So this is the law, and this is what they did about it. The background was unfortunate. This is they go and testify, but then they go to the governor. The health department made a record of 31 cases. They talk about the number of cases. It would have been imprudent at this point, when they're talking to try to stop this legislation, to point out that exposure from toys and children's furniture is negligible and that children can contact other surfaces covered with lead. That would have invited broader legislation. In other words, if we had protested this bill too strongly and said, look, the toys and cribs aren't the real problem, it's really the paint on the walls, it would have encouraged broader legislation. Broader legislation restricting the use of lead. So they're actually going out of their way and figuring, we know the real problem is lead on the walls. They're trying to ban it in toys and cribs, which is a minor problem. But we can't point out that toys and cribs are just a minor problem, and this bill is stupid, because it would then raise the prospect of their going broader. And actually, we bring attention to lead on the walls. The problem continues to be, and this is one of the jokes that they continually have in their notes, children who develop lead poisoning get these headaches, right? Their heads ache. This problem continues to be a major headache, a source of much adverse publicity, of which the Baltimore publications herewith are but two examples. They start joking about a headache. The children have headaches. But granting that many could be shown to be of doubtful validity, these are the cases that are being discovered in Baltimore, this would not lessen the adverse publicity, and is in my considered opinion that we must find means of securing more accurate diagnoses of lead poisoning, or face the likelihood of widespread governmental prohibition of the use of lead paints on dwellings. I can go through many of these. Many thanks for the letter. This is the one, I'm going to end after these next three slides, because I'm realizing that I could go on for I have around 3 hours of slides. I don't know whether you want to stay here for that. But you read this material and it's just enraging. You say, I have to have this in here. So I promise you, 4 slides from now, I'm going to stop, okay? This is a letter between the head of the Lead Industries Association and Felix Wurmser, who had become the Undersecretary of the Interior. He had formerly been the head of the association. He was made into the head of the part of the Department of Interior that stored lead for the nation. This is during the Cold War. This is 1955. And they're complaining about an article that appeared in Parade magazine that Sunday. That Sunday, there'd been an article about lead poisoning among children, and they're very upset about it. Here's what they say. Sure, I'm irritated about this article, but more than that, I'm baffled. Aside from the kids that are poisoned, and we still don't know how many there are, it's a serious problem from the viewpoint of adverse publicity, the same issue. And here's where the racism that plagues this whole issue, and we didn't really go into very strongly, is a continual kind of leitmotif throughout this whole history about why people were not paying more attention to it and why they could say to audiences that it's not that important. And here's their thinking. The basic solution is to get rid of our slums. Whoops. But even Uncle Sam can't seem to swing that one. Next in the importance is to educate the parents, but most of the cases are in Negro and Puerto Rican families, and how does that one tackle that job? They had continually said, if you remember that image that Jerry showed you about the dangers to the middle-class home, he kind of went over quickly, where there was, he said about the black migration from the South, threatening the middle-class home. This is a leitmotif that keeps showing up, that it's really affecting only one part of our population, and we really can't do much about that because we can't get rid of slums, and we can't educate the parents to somehow keep their houses pristinely clean. And therefore, it's their problem, not ours, so to speak. This is, with public health officials, local and state and national, I've been at some pains to cultivate their goodwill and get them into a receptive frame of mind about not doing anything about this problem. I feel that this has paid off, as for example in Chicago, where we have been able to stave off paint labeling regulation. They even fought the idea of telling people, don't use this around children. Don't put a label on it saying it's dangerous to use near children. Paint labeling regulation like that here in New York. The exchange with Jerome Trichter, of which copies are here with it as a case in point. New York had passed a mild labeling regulation, New York City. And they'd said, you have to tell people not to use this on toys because this stuff is really dangerous. This is by the 1950s. I want to show you this because this is kind of the ultimate statement of what their plan will be in 1955. What they said they were going to try to do in 1955. I find this a heartbreaking outline of their program for the future. This is now 60 some odd years ago, which they understood the dangers from lead. They understood it was on the walls of our homes. They understood that children were being poisoned, and this is their response. Whoops. This is how they think they have to handle it. They have to convince us, the public, that childhood lead poisoning is childhood lead poisoning is essentially a problem of slum dwellings and relatively ignorant parents. It's not our problem as a society, it's their problem. It's the people living in the slums and the ignorant parents. That's how they define the problem, not as our problem as a society or their problem as a company. That the importance of the problem lies primarily not in the number of cases, but in the likelihood of permanent brain damage and in the great difficulty of instituting really effective preventive measures. It's impossible to prevent it, and the real problem is only the kids who die. If you don't have a kid who dies, we have to make sure it's defined as not a serious problem. Minimal damage, the kind of chronic damages that are being identified at that point, that's not the issue. Make sure we understand that the real problem is only when children die. That until we can find means to get rid of our slums and educate the relatively uneducable parent, the problem will continue to plague us. What a cynical statement 60 years ago. 60 years ago to know that it will continue to plague us for the next 60 years. We're sitting here today and still discussing this issue. And they understood that it was going to continue because they weren't going to get rid of the slums. They weren't going to remedy the problem in the houses. They weren't going to deal with it other than as a problem of poor people living in those dilapidated houses. It was not going to be defined as a problem of all of us as a society. It's heartrending. And here's their final statement. And finally, that if you know how to answer those two, getting rid of slums and educating ineducable parents, as they call them, you are more of a genius than I think you. What cynical statements they are. So I'm going to stop here because I can go on forever, but I want to end with these two images. Every time I go by a store that has that image, I think of a piece from The Onion magazine. Does anybody read The Onion up here? You get it? Okay. Satirical magazine. It had an article once with this image on it, and it said, Sherwin-Williams announces a big breakthrough. They've now figured out how to cover the entire northern hemisphere with lead. They've always had a problem with the fact that lead dripped off the side of the globe, but they've now figured out how to make sure it covers the whole globe. Every time I see it, I think of that and the cynicism that went into covering the globe with lead. And this, I just want to end, this will be my last slide. When Jerry and I were testifying the suit in Rhode Island, which was a suit in which we were each kept in separate rooms in separate parts of the hotel, weren't allowed to speak to each other, weren't allowed to speak to our families, weren't allowed to speak to lawyers, weren't allowed to speak to anyone, and we were on the stand for 6 days, right? We began obsessing about all the little mistakes we made when we were testifying. For me, I was obsessing. It was like being in solitary confinement, where you can't talk to anyone about the issues that are on your mind all the time. I was obsessing about whether I had gotten the population of Rhode Island in 1900, whether I had made a mistake by 100,000 people, and whether when the lawyer threw his hands up and said, you're an outsider, you're not from here, you can't possibly know our problems, whether that had made an impression on the jury. I was crazed by that one stupid little fact that I got wrong. I said it was a million, it was actually 900,000. He made a big deal. It was a silly thing. You have to be in the trial to understand how, this after 6 days on the stand. And I thought, well, maybe nobody really believed this data. And I was walking into court for my last day on the stand and passed this kid. They had demonstrations outside the trial every day. In this case, it was parents who had gloves of children who had been lead poisoned in Rhode Island. They're very moving. And I realized that Jerry's and my work, the work that we actually uncovered and presented to the jury, was perfectly well understood when I saw this kid. There was this little kid holding up a sign saying they knew for decades. So thank you very much, and we'd love to answer some questions from panel. I don't know quite how it's panel. Thank you very much.